Well, welcome to our second video in the series, Identification and Control of Invasive Plants in Forest Environments. And this is our control and management video. So we'll be talking about how to deal with the actual control and management of invasive species on the landscape. So we did our first video looking at identification, one of the first steps in actually approaching management, so you can recognize those species on the ground, understand how to deal with them. Now we're going to actually talk about how to go about thinking about an effective control program to manage these invasive species that you encounter on your properties. So one of our first goals is to actually think about a progressive approach of invasive species management on the landscape. And we're going to talk about preventing invasions. So some of the practices we can use to make sure invasive species don't get on your properties and don't get a foothold, establishing new species populations. If you do have invasive species coming in your property, thinking about early detection and rapid response to those invasions. And then those invasive species that you already have are going to get in the future, what are the effective and efficient control techniques you can utilize? And then what are the resources and assistance sources you can access to help you in this fight to manage your property to make sure it stays in good condition? So one of the first things I would tell you to do if you're getting ready to manage invasive species on your property is not just depend on this video for information, but also to consult local expertise and seek those folks out to get advice and assistance on how best to manage the problems that you have on your property. And there are several really good sources of information that are available to you as a landowner. One of them that is developing across the state, not all counties have this yet, but many do, are local cooperative invasive species management areas. And these are organizations oftentimes made up of multiple individual interested citizens and organizations and agencies that are banding together to help folks effectively manage invasive species in a particular county or region of the state. And the Southern Indiana Cooperative Invasive Management Group is helping organize this development of these what's called CISMAs, Cooperative Invasive Species Management Areas across the state. Their website is a good link to give you information about whether you've got a CISMA in your area and how to get a hold of those folks. And many of them actually offer some identification assistance on the ground that can give you information on control as well. Another really good source of information are your district forester with the Indiana Division of Forestry, and also your district wildlife biologist with the Indiana Division of Fish and Wildlife. These folks are available to help private landowners on their properties. There are some limitations to the services they provide. For the district foresters, are typically working in areas with 10 acres or more of forest or other types of habitat. Biologists also sometimes have limited scope and areas that they're able to work in, but you can contact these folks to either get a site visit or to get advice and assistance on where to go for additional assistance and management. There are private sector foresters and also private sector environmental management companies that will do invasive species management on the ground. And so they can help you not only with the management planning, but also with the actual management of your land. They work on a fee basis, but can provide great kind of door-to-door services that'll help you get your property managed and in good condition. And you can find the private foresters from findindianaforester.org. And the folks with SICM can help hook you up also with private contractors that do invasive species management and work. And then two local sources of information that are excellent for almost any kind of conservation, agriculture, or other natural resource issues in your county are the County Soil and Water Conservation District, SWCDs, and your county Purdue Cooperative Extension Service office. Both of these offices have folks that are well aware and very familiar with what's happening in your county when it comes to natural resources and agriculture, and can direct you to those folks that can give you the best assistance. The other thing we want to look at is a broad scale look across the landscape of what are some of the better practices, the best management practices we can adopt to help us in this invasive species management issue area. And so we have to look on a landscape scale, recognizing that invasive species do not respect property boundaries, that they spread seed and plant material far and wide through wind, water, and wildlife scattering that seed. And so getting a larger view of the landscape and an effort to manage these species across the landscape is going to be ultimately our best approach to get success. And we have a nice series of best management practices developed for Indiana, and you can find them at the Indiana Invasive Species Council website. This particular group is kind of the overarching umbrella organization for invasive species management across the state, and their website provides a lot of great resources, including this list of best management practices for management on your property. And I'm just going to do a quick overview of some of these to give you an idea of some of the principles that we're using in terms of thinking about invasive species through time. And so one of the best preventative techniques for working against invasive species is to make sure we're not planting them on the landscape on purpose. And so when we think about landscaping, wildlife, or reforestation plantings, or other types of conservation or even landscape plantings, we want to really think about using native species. This provides us an opportunity to provide those critical habitat elements for wildlife using the native plants that they are adapted to, as opposed to bringing in exotic plants that in fact, in many cases don't meet the broad scope of wildlife needs that we have to fill those habitat requirements and may escape into the natural environment and become a weed on the landscape. So planting natives is one of our best practices and getting away from using non-native materials. The other thing we don't want to do is move contaminated materials around to establish new populations of invasive species through seeds or plant parts. And so think about when you're moving any kind of material like gravel, sand, soil that could contain plant seeds, how likely is it that you're actually moving a material onto your property that's going to create a weed problem later? So getting the cleanest, most reliable material you can when you move, or monitoring that material after you've moved it to make sure you can get on top of any invasive species that pop up. Also think about our tools and equipment. If it can get dirt caked on it, it's a potential movement place for seeds to move from one spot to another on your property. And we're thinking about things like shovels, tractor tires, mower decks. All of those can transport seed to a variety of locations that you don't want them to land. We also want to think about folks that are going to enter your property to do work. And so one of the things that we've actually done with our Purdue properties when we have a timber sale is part of our timber sale contract is that there will be clean equipment only allowed on the properties. And so when the loggers are moving from one job to the next, before they get on one of our Purdue properties to start their operations, their equipment has to be cleaned of all dirt and residue that would have the potential to carry invasive species seed. I think that's a good practice for almost anybody wanting to do a timber harvest to prevent the potential for some of these small seeded species to be introduced on your property. So having that as part of your contract or your arrangement with any contractors that do work on the ground for you is a good way to start. And then also educating other people that may use your property about the potential for invasive species to enter. And so clean boots, not bringing non-native plants or other materials onto the property. One of our big problems with fisheries is people moving fish around between ponds and streams and other locations. And so anybody that uses your property, making sure they're educated about safeguards and best management practices related to managing invasive species. Another good practice is to monitor disturbed areas for invasions of invasive species. So invasive species oftentimes can come into existing areas without any kind of disturbance, but disturbances that create extra sunlight, bare soil, perhaps move soil around are opportunities for these species to really jump in place and grow well. And so it's oftentimes one of your best scouting practices to look at edges of fields, any place where there's been storm damage, a timber harvest, or any kind of construction activity. Those are prime spots for invasive species to become established. And then both for your property and on a larger landscape scale, we really need to think about developing strategies and knowledge bases that are going to help us effectively manage these species through time. And that goes into having kind of a long-term plan for managing invasive species not only on your property but on the landscape. And one thing I would add about management of invasive species is that white-tailed deer populations. We've seen a variety of experiments that indicate that high white-tailed deer populations, in some cases for some species, actually allow invasive species to become more numerous on the ground. They provide them, through overbrowsing of native plants, an opportunity for them to occupy that space and start overtaking the landscape in some locations. So managing the level of deer population on your property may be part of managing invasive species on your property. When it comes to early detection, we actually have some great tools that you can use across the state. We have a report in website through a variety of organizations working in Indiana. This provides a place for you to report invasive species by either computer or smartphone or call. And you can actually access a smartphone app at this website that you can download on your phone that allows you to report invasive species that you come across, and also have some resources for identification of invasive species that perhaps you're not familiar with. And this leaf here is a good example of that. This is castor oil tree. It is not a common invasive in Indiana, but one that is emerging in locations. It can be a large tree, very thorny, and because the seeds are eaten by birds, it does have a pretty high potential to spread. And so if we can locate these infestations early, before they become large, we hopefully can stop this invasion in its tracks and prevent this from becoming the kind of problem that many of our other invasive species already are. And anytime we're working on this type of management with a lot of work to be done, a lot of area to cover, we need to develop a sort of plan of attack, a prioritized list of things to do and how to approach this effectively and efficiently. And one of our first things is to effectively identify the problem. And so what are our problem areas? What are the plants that we have to deal with? What size of those plants? What are some of the logistic considerations of operating in the area? What kind of tools and equipment are we going to need to do this effectively? So all those things figure into our planning process. One of the things I like to do is try to prioritize the work areas that I'm going to be working in. There's always less time, it seems like, to do the work than we need to get everything done. And so I want to work the most effectively and efficiently I can to get the most benefits for the time I put into that effort. And what I'm usually trying to do is working from the least infested areas to the most infested areas. And that may sound kind of counterintuitive, but the reason we do that is in the least infested areas, we're oftentimes looking at small plants that are not yet producing seed and that have done minimal damage to the environment so far and are a small part of the plant population in that area. So if we can kill the plants in those areas and prevent them from becoming established and competitive with our natives have a better chance of retaining dominance on that site, and we reduce the amount of biological damage that's done there. But we also want to look at where is that seed coming from that is seeding into those areas that are least infested. And so one of the other priorities I have is to look and see where the seed producers are. And so I want to slow the spread of this plant that's causing me problems by making sure I cut off seed production. So I may need to go into some of those more infested areas and looking for those larger plants that are the primary seed producers. And I want to also control those very quickly to make sure that I'm not getting new seed production every year that's contributing to that population problem that I'm working down. And then once again, as I mentioned, we want to look at areas where we've had disturbance. Those are prime spots for new invasives to come in. And then do a regular monitoring process on areas that I've done management on before, because we recognize that, once again, our property boundaries don't limit the spread of invasives. It may be coming in from our neighbors as well. And depending on the scale of your invasion, you may have to look at getting tooled up or finding additional assistance to actually effectively do this work. So if you don't have a lot of tools that are suitable for large scale cutting or clearing of invasives, it may be time to either think about acquiring some of those or hiring somebody that can help you do that work to make sure that it's done effectively, efficiently, and you get the results that you want. And a good example is this photo. This, unfortunately, is on some of our Purdue property that we've since done a lot of management on to get rid of these plants. This is Asian bush honeysuckle, and you can see the size of these, 15 to 20 feet tall, almost a solid green wall in some places. and it required an enormous amount of effort or some specialized tools, which we'll show you later, to effectively do this type of work. And finally, in this whole plan of attack, we've got to recognize that one and done is just not the case with invasive species management. Oftentimes, it's 3 or 4 years to get a property back under control that's had a major invasive species infestation. And then we really can't let up on our monitoring and follow-up management. As soon as we do, we oftentimes get new invasives seeding into that area, and they can grow quite quickly. And if we're not paying attention, if they start dropping seed, we've got a whole new problem to deal with over time. So the work is never done, but we can get it pushed down to a manageable level if it's done on a regular basis. And we have several tools in our toolkit that we can utilize. We have mechanical control mechanisms, and this would be pulling, cutting, girdling, burning, barriers, anything that we can use as a physical activity against these plants. A developing area, we don't have as many tools in this toolkit, but they're coming along, is biological control. And this is where we're using predators, parasites, grazing, diseases, uh, interplant competition or modification of the characteristics of the site that are going to serve as a biological control or biological barrier to these plants becoming established or dominant. And then another tool that's well developed and we use quite often in this fight against invasive species is the chemical control approach, using a variety of herbicides to help us get control of these pests on the landscape. But what I really encourage you to think about is an integrated pest management approach to this whole fight against invasives, and that is looking at what techniques or combination of techniques are going to give us the best results with the tools we have to provide us with the best long-term sustainable effective control techniques, and also looking at how we can limit risk and damage to the land we have while still accomplishing our goals of getting rid of the invasive species. So some of the mechanical means that we have for controlling invasives, if you've got really serious invasives in terms of density and size, you may have to look at some pretty high-powered equipment. And so bulldozer is one option, although it's one we don't use very often, partly because of the amount of soil disturbance that's done. Something that's being used much more now on the right-hand side of the screen are the skid steer mulching heads. And these are quickly rotating drums that will grind up and mulch up invasive plants into a fine mulch. They can even be pushed into the ground a little bit to bust up root systems. Very effective, very efficient, but also quite expensive in terms of equipment, time, and capital expenditure. Pardon me, if you've got smaller scale invasions, or you don't mind kind of working away at a property over time, there's a lot of hand and small power tools that are perfectly suited to invasive species control. On the right-hand side is a brush saw. I use this extensively on my property to get my Asian bush honeysuckle and also grapevine infestations under control. Very effective, very efficient, also very safe. It's got a shoulder harness that clips onto the piece of equipment. I've literally fallen down holding this equipment, and because of the setup with the shoulder harness, you really can't hardly cut yourself. You just can't hardly access that cutter head, and so I find it safer and easier to use than a chainsaw. Very effective at cutting off small and medium-sized shrubs. There's a variety of levers and pullers that you can utilize to get a mechanical advantage to pop these species out of the ground by the roots. Some people really like using those because that avoids having to use a lot of herbicide. But it does take a little bit of oomph, but a lot of these will help you in terms of giving you that mechanical advantage. And also some hand cutting tools. So oftentimes I'm carrying either a hatchet or a folding saw in my pocket or on a holster when I'm cruising the woods to take care of any invasives that I run into with those. And we've got a little video here showing one of these mulcher heads. The advantage of these is that you can very quickly knock down a very dense invasive species infestation and have a very clean understory that's suitable for natural regeneration of native plants or for planting if that's your intended purpose. Very effective, very efficient, but also an expensive piece of equipment and a pretty high hourly rate. But what we've seen in terms of the breakdown between this and physical manual labor is this actually can be a more efficient economic approach to really heavy infestations with lots and lots of big plants per acre. Several different types of pulling equipment that you can utilize, both hand powered and also hooked up to mechanical means. So a variety of chains and graspers and levers that you can utilize. I've used some of these, although I don't have a tractor, so I can't use the big stuff. But there is some good use for these, particularly for folks that would really prefer not to do cutting or not utilize herbicides. So I mentioned one of my favorite tools is the brush saw. This is a little higher horsepower version of a weed eater, but you'll notice that it's got a cutter head and also a two-handled, essentially tricycle handle to give you a little better stability as you're working that cutter head into wood. It can kick back a little bit, and the shoulder harness is a very important part of that. I would not ever use this piece of equipment without a harness because of the potential kickback. You could definitely separate a foot from an ankle if you're not careful. With the harness, very safe. The only danger really with the harness is anybody that's working around you. They need to stay several yards back to make sure there's no possibility that you're swinging that around and actually accidentally hit them with that cutting head. But very effective at cutting off shrubs and vines and brush. And I've used this for many hours. I really like the cutter heads that have the chainsaw teeth embedded, much easier to sharpen. And because you're working down there at ground level, you invariably will hit some rocks or wire and dull the blade over time. Biological control is an emerging area and a little more difficult to deal with. We oftentimes, because we have invasive plants that are from other regions, their natural predators, parasites, and diseases are in those other regions too. And there's some inherent risk in bringing those elements over to the new location where this invasive plant is established because they could cross over into other native plants or organisms. And so there's a screening process that has to go on if we're going to bring any of those non-native predators, pests, or parasites of our problematic plants over. But for some species, that screening process has taken place. And what we found is we do have a few tools in place that we can utilize. So one that's actually interesting is using goats. Goats will not completely control most invasive plants, but what they do is munch them down to size so that they're much easier to come in and actually get on the landscape and spray with herbicides, pull, or otherwise use other control mechanisms. And a good example is our Extension Forester in southern Indiana, Ron Rathfon, has used goats inside enclosed paddocks to chew down essentially multiflora rose and other invasives, making it possible for him to then come in with a backpack sprayer or a ATV carried sprayer and apply herbicide to those much smaller plants that are a lot easier to navigate through. And so it's a tool very much like the brush saw or the mulcher head that we use simply to knock the size of these plants down to make it more manageable to control them. But we do have some good examples of potential biological control from diseases and other organisms. And so on the upper right-hand photo, we've got a variety of dead stems there, and that's all Ailanthus, tree of heaven. Very aggressive, difficult to control invasive tree species in our woodlands and waste areas. But what's happened is they've found a native verticillium wilt fungus that is deadly on Ailanthus, but so far does not appear to be much of a problem for most of our native tree species. The Forest Service and others are still researching this to make sure that it's going to be safe and effective to use, but the preliminary results are very promising, as this is a natural biological control for the tree of heaven. So far, the outbreaks of this have been found in Ohio and Pennsylvania, although we're keeping a sharp eye here in Indiana. And so if you recognize Ailanthus and ever see patches that are wilting and dying, be sure to report them to your extension educator, soil and water conservation district office, or DNR, particularly the DNR Division of Entomology and Plant Pathology. They're looking to try to find this particular fungus in Indiana, which then provides us an opportunity to utilize it as a natural control agent for Ailanthus. On the lower left-hand side, we've got grass carp. This is an invasive, non-native species, potentially invasive. Oftentimes they're bred to be sterile, and they're utilized in ponds to consume vegetation, and so essentially as a pond cleanup animal. And on the lower right is a small beetle that is a predator of purple loosestrife, which is a terrible invasive flowering plant. Beautiful purple flowers, but very aggressive in wetland areas. But this particular beetle, because of its voracious appetite for purple loosestrife, is able to maintain its populations and give our native plants in these wetland areas an opportunity to continue to exist and be competitive with that purple loosestrife. So as we mentioned, judicious use of grazing, we can use that to reduce the size and extent of invasive plants. But most of our invasive plants, particularly the perennials and woody plants, are able to resprout from root systems. So it's just one part of the practice of management. We can also use management practices that create environments that are unfavorable for these invasive plants to either live or spread. And so this might be using things like fire or shading to kind of counteract the life cycles of some of these plants. And we can also utilize, as we mentioned with like the purple loosestrife, pests of some of these plants can provide us a way to reduce the populations and make sure they don't spread aggressively or outcompete our native plants. And once again, this example of the Ailanthus or tree of heaven wilt in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and we're hoping, as I mentioned, at some point in time to find it in Indiana. So our next control technique is chemical control. And this is just as the name implies, we're using a variety of different registered pesticides to control plants on the landscape. And that control could either be a targeted control. And so on the upper right-hand picture, we've got a spray bottle squirting a cut stump. Lower left-hand picture, we've got a backpack sprayer spraying a defined plant or area. Or it could be more of a broadcast application. And so the lower right-hand corner, we've got an understory forest area that's overrun with the vine Japanese honeysuckle, and we're using a broadcast application on the back of a skidder or a tractor to put as much herbicide as possible on that infestation, since it's almost the only plant that exists in that location. One thing when using herbicides, and really any of these tools or equipment, is to recognize the personal protective equipment, the safety gear that you need to have to safely, effectively, and legally utilize these materials or tools. And so when it comes to herbicides, there is a label on the herbicide that gives you all that information. It not only tells you what the active ingredients in the herbicide are, what the appropriate application techniques and methods are, but also the appropriate safety equipment that you need to be wearing to utilize that, and when you can come back in safely into the area, and what plants it's effective on. And so this is very important information to make sure that you're doing the appropriate applications, and also recognizing that that label is the law when it comes to actual application of herbicides. So some of our herbicide application techniques. Basal bark applications use an oil carrier to deliver an oil-based herbicide into the plant. And so we're actually spraying this oil herbicide mix onto the lower stem of the plant, and that oil penetrates through the bark into the plant, whether it be a tree or shrub, delivering the chemical into the plant. Then that chemical then is designed to kill or control the plant. And some of the materials that we use, triclopyr esters, products like Garlon 4 and Triclopyr 4 trade names, and also Invasive products are commonly used in this type of application, along with the carrier oil, which is an on-purpose formulation for herbicide use of basil oil or fuel oil, kerosene, or diesel as carriers. And we really are recommending folks use basil oil as much as possible. These are formulated on purpose to pair up with these herbicides and do a good job of penetration. But the other materials are, in fact, typically on the labels for these products as a potential carrier oil as well. But for personal environmental safety, we lean toward using the basil oils. You want to apply this herbicide oil mix to the lower 18 inches of the stems. We're usually starting at the top of the stem and kind of running a little bit of herbicide all the way around, and then go down the stem until we get full coverage but not flow off onto the soil. And the oil actually decreases the surface tension, so it does a good job of spreading that herbicide around the stem. This tends to work best on smaller diameter material and material with relatively smooth bark, but it can be quite effective on a wide range of plants. And the real advantage here is that you don't have to cut. And so you're strictly using a herbicide application to kill these standing plants. So here's a herbicide application on autumn olive. Smooth bark, and so those are really set up nicely for basil bark applications. And when it comes to the application, real low pressure, and just kind of dribble that herbicide onto the bark and let it run around is the appropriate approach. And so what we're really looking for with any of these controls is an efficient, effective control of invasives to meet our land management objectives. And oftentimes what we're doing is actually combining a variety of different practices, mechanical, chemical, and biological, to get our very best results in the most efficient and effective manner with the tools we've got. Now, understanding how to put these combinations together typically requires a combination of some research work, practical experience and knowledge from people that have done this many times in many locations, and then some communication back and forth to share our experiences and what has worked and what hasn't. And that's really, it goes back to making sure that you talk with some local expertise to avoid mistakes and get the very best information you can to do it right the first time. So some of the tools that I use in combination with each other, once again, my trusty brush saw for cutting, but I also will typically follow up with some sort of herbicide application. And that might be a herbicide application to the cut stump that I just created, or more often in my case, since I'm oftentimes working alone with this equipment, I'll do all my cutting and then allow those plants to actually sprout and bring a backpack sprayer back with a foliar herbicide and spray the leaves on those sprouts to ultimately control that whole plant. I find it just more efficient than going back and forth between having the brush cutter and then picking up a sprayer, or having to pick up the spray wand and try to spray that same thing I cut. But very much personal preference and your operational efficiencies, you can decide how best to do those things. The cutting and herbicide combination, though, is a very effective one. And so what we're doing is we're taking cutting tools, taking off the bulk of the plant biomass at around ground line. And so we've removed a lot of the reserves of that plant and its leaf producing capacity. And then we apply a herbicide to that cut stump. And so that herbicide is designed to kill the root system of the plant so we don't get resprouting. And so that combination is a very effective approach at killing a lot of invasive plants, and also limits the amount of herbicide we have to use by targeting it to that one small cut location. This has a real advantage of minimal herbicide application and also very effective treatment of plants in terms of percent killed. The thing we've got to recognize is if you're using a water-based herbicide, you need to apply that herbicide to that cut very quickly after the cutting is done, within a few minutes. What happens is if that stem is dried out, oftentimes it will not accept that water-based herbicide, and so the herbicide can't penetrate and it can't do its job. Very much like the base of a Christmas tree drying out, you need to cut that off again for it to actually take up any water and keep your tree nice and green. Same ideology here. The other thing we've got to watch out for with cut stump applications is in the spring, some of these species will be running sap prolifically and often, And if they are, that has a tendency to wash the herbicide back out of the cut. And once again, we don't get good performance. And so you just want to change your season of application for the actual cutting and treatments if that's the case with a particular plant. So here's our process. We cut our stem off, and then we get our herbicide out. And the actually application point that's critical is to make sure we get herbicide on that zone where the bark and the cambium are. The cambium is the tissue that grows new cells both inside and outside toward the bark and toward the insides of the tree that transport food and water up and down the tree. And so getting our herbicide on that bark cambium zone is the critical part. For larger stems, so you're just squirting on the outside edge, that interior material is mostly dead and supportive or storage. For smaller stems, just to squirt across the whole surface of the cut is adequate. The other option we've got is to take our cutting tools and, as I mentioned, simply cut off the vegetation and then walk away for about a growing season and come back at the second half of that growing season after we've cut the plants off. They've resprouted in most cases. We can then take a foliar spray herbicide and spray that foliage to get good coverage across all the leaf area. That will then carry that herbicide into the plant and kill the tops and root system. And so what we've done is simply reduce the amount of surface area that we've got to spray to get good effective control by taking that large plant and turning it into a much smaller sprout. It is important to recognize, though, that we need to do that treatment probably that next season. If you wait 2 seasons, those sprouts are growing off of a nice big established root system. And what we can have is actually quite a large plant redevelop off that large root system, and we've really not gained much in that process then. We've still got a huge plant that we've got to treat all that foliage to get good control. Girdling, girdling and frilling are effective methods of killing some of our larger trees and in some cases even large shrubs. Normally, though, if we got a tree that's 6 inches or more in diameter, that may be suitable for girdling. Those are oftentimes a little harder to fell, or we may decide we don't want to fell them because we're going to put more slash on the ground, or we're going to be doing damage to other standing trees in the area. And so it's just easier and more effective to do the girdling technique. In most cases, we're going to use a single cut with a herbicide application in that cut to control that tree. And so with the cut, we're separating the vascular tissue that runs food and water up and down the tree. And with the herbicide, we're killing the cambium in that zone so it can't grow new tissue to gap over that cut. If you don't want to use herbicide, you can do 2 cuts with the chainsaw, typically an inch in, both cuts up and down to get through the bark, through the cambium, into the sapwood to create essentially this dead zone in between the 2 cuts. And usually that's 3 to 6 inches apart. This typically works reasonably well, but there are some species that'll have deeply buried vascular tissue, and they can actually run past that girdling cut in some cases. So the addition of herbicide is some extra insurance to give you better results over time. If you don't want to run a chainsaw, you can still use a hatchet or even a machete or a small axe to cut either a bare girdle band all the way around the tree, taking off the bark, the cambium into the sapwood, and a band all the way around the tree, 3 to 4 inches or so, or to do a frilling cut like we've got here on the right hand side, where we hack down at about a 45-degree angle, creating little pockets all the way around the tree, and we're going to squirt herbicide into those pockets to create that dead zone that produces our girdling. Some of the herbicide materials we're utilizing for this are the triclopyr amines. This is a water-based formulation. Some of the trade names: Vaslan, Triclopyr 3A, Garlon 3A, or Element 3A. Another material that's been used for many years is Tordon RTU, or Pathway. This is a mixture of picloram and 2,4-D, usually in a ready-to-use formula, already pre-mixed, and even has a dye in it in most cases. And this is put right into the girdle. Or we can use glyphosate at either the concentrate right out of the jug, but oftentimes we'll cut that with up to 50% water and 50% glyphosate concentrate, and you can spray that in the girdle cut, and that tends to be most effective during the growing season. So let's talk a little bit about some of the herbicides we have in our toolkit that we can utilize for a variety of different control techniques. We've mentioned glyphosate, lots and lots of different trade names for glyphosate. Some of the more common ones: Roundup, Razor, Razor Pro, Imitator Plus, GlyPro, but there's many out there. What you're actually looking for on the label is the active ingredient of glyphosate at for the concentrate, 41% active ingredient or higher. And so that's what you're typically looking for. It doesn't kind of matter as much what the trade name is, but that's the important part, the actual chemistry that you want to find. This is a fine herbicide for a variety of different applications for controlling invasive species. It's an excellent material for a lot of foliar applications when we're spraying live leaf area during the growing season. We'll mix our herbicide concentrate with water, and we're typically using anywhere from 2 to 5% of the concentrate in the balanced water. But we do have an issue with water quality. If you have high pH or hard water, that can actually be a problem for deactivating some of your glyphosate. And so we recommend you condition your water, if that's the case, before you actually add your glyphosate to it. And so what we normally recommend is, if you're using a backpack sprayer and it's going to be a 3 or 4 gallon water capacity, put 1 to 2 cups of spray grade ammonium sulfate, it's a fine granule, into 3 to 4 gallons of your spray water, and then add your herbicide, surfactant, and penetrants as needed. This is going to condition that water to make your glyphosate much more effective. The other thing you can do is use softened water or collect rainwater. Those are good options as well. In some cases with plants that have waxy leaves, very thick leaves or very hairy leaves, it is beneficial to add surfactants and penetrants to your mix. Surfactants are things like dish soap and then commercially available surfactants that help break the water tension and allow that water to soak into the plant rather than run off. Excuse me. Penetrants are things like methylated seed oil and bean oil, and you maybe use only like 1% of that in your mix, and that can help actually penetrate the herbicide into and through waxy coatings on leaves or stems. And I also like to use a dye, partly to help me know exactly where I've put my spray, and also to see if I have gotten any spray on myself or my equipment, so that I can take the appropriate cleanup measures after the fact. So dyes are very helpful as well. And typically these are all materials that are sold the same places you can get your herbicides: farm stores, co-ops, and a variety of online retailers and wholesalers. Glyphosate can also be used for cut stump or girdling applications. And so on freshly cut stumps, we could apply the straight concentrate or dilute it with up to 50% water, and that's normally what I do, anywhere from 25 to 50% water and the balanced concentrate. And this treatment does need to go on, though, right after you cut off those stems. Once again, if they dry off, they can seal. And so after a few minutes, if that starts drying up, we don't get good herbicide penetration and we won't get good control. And also, once again, as we mentioned, beware of early spring. When the sap is running strongly, it can wash your herbicide right off those cut stumps, and so it's not an effective treatment. Another material that we're using quite a bit in forestry applications now is triclopyr-based formulations. 2 different formulations of this. There's a acid salt or amine formulation that's water-based and used in water mixes. Vaslan, Garlan 3A, Element 3A, Triclopyr 3A are all trade names. And then this particular material is used for girdling, frilling, and cut stump treatments, and can also be used for foliar applications mixed in water. For the cut stump and girdle and frill cutting, we're typically using either the straight herbicide or cut with 50% water. Garlan 4, Element 4 or Pathfinder 2 is an ester-based formulation of the triclopyr, so oil-based. And this is mixed with oil or oil and water formulations, but it's not labeled for girdle frill applications. And so I've heard of some people using it for that, and they typically say they don't get very good results. And part of the reason is it's not formulated to be used that way. And so it's not on the label, so it's a use that you shouldn't be doing with it. But it is very effective for the basal bark application and the cut stump applications. So we'll take our our triclopyr ester, whatever the particular material that we've purchased, at 15 to 20% of that herbicide in the balance our oil, and it could be the basal oil, kerosene, or diesel oil. And then we would spray that either as a basal bark spray or as a cut stump application. And the great thing is that that application for cut stump can be sprayed on hours or days after we actually do the cutting. And so because of the oil being able to penetrate, that provides us a little more flexibility in our application. But it's a more expensive material to utilize because we're paying for both the herbicide and the oil. And in any of these cases, once again, always follow those label directions and safety recommendations. A material that's been around for a long time, we find it on the farm store and garden center shelves every now and then, is Tordon RTU. You can also get the same type of material called Pathway, typically in larger containers, two or 2.5 gallon jugs. This is a pre-mixed, ready-to-use formulation for cut stump and girdling or frilling applications, and it's very effective. It does a really good job of controlling a large range of species. It's a combination of the herbicides picloram and 2,4-D. But one of the things we found is that this is somewhat mobile in the soil and relatively long-lived. And so you need to be careful with how much of this material you utilize on a site. I tend to steer away from it when we've got lots and lots of invasive species per acre. We're going to be treating a lot of surface area with this, and so that means a lot of herbicide per acre. You could get unintended consequences for other species that you don't want to control, typically or simply because of the soil movement and the longevity of this material on the site. In small doses, no problem, very effective. With one exception, tulip tree or tulip poplar is very sensitive to this particular material, and I've seen this personally. I was killing some kind of weedy old cottonwood. They're competing with a lot of other nicer trees on my property. And this one particular cottonwood was about 30 to 40 feet away from this really nice little tulip tree. And I thought, well, I'm probably going to be okay. I'll go ahead and use my Tordon in my girdling cut. But sure enough, the next spring, the tulip tree was still alive, but its foliage was all twisted and contorted. It was clearly not very happy with that Tordon in the neighborhood. So if you've got tulip tree in the area, I would typically recommend against using this particular item. The other thing about this is if you buy it in the quart applicator bottles, I would not use those bottles. The applicator bottles are a pull top, and what you tend to do is you use about 2 to 4 times more material than is really needed to get good control in your girdling cuts or your cut stumps. And so I would transfer that material to a squirt bottle or a sprayer, which is going to be much easier to control, and you'll put a judicious amount on there that's just enough to do the appropriate control and cover the area that you want to control. So those are some of our primary herbicides that we recommend you as a landowner can access and use. Here's some of the applications for the different techniques. So some good candidates for foliar herbicide application are smaller examples, typically 6 feet or less, of almost any of the bushes. So bush, honeysuckle, or vines like Japanese honeysuckle. Some of the herbaceous materials like garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, Japanese knotweeds, or almost any of the plants that are less than 6 feet tall. When it gets over 6 feet tall, foliar applications become much more difficult, and you've got a much higher probability of getting drift onto non-target plants when you're spraying up in the air or trying to get it across these large areas. So smaller material is better when it comes to foliar application. If we're using glyphosate, we want to make sure these plants are green and actively growing. And so beware of trying to spray too soon in the spring. I've not had good results with newly emerging leaves. We want to typically wait till mid-season or later. And it's oftentimes most effective in the later season. Also, plants that have waxy leaf coats or really fuzzy leaves, you're going to want to add additional surfactants and penetrants to your glyphosate. So just having glyphosate in a water mix with species like privet and autumn olive, I've not had good luck with that. They tend to kind of fight it off, and so you'll need additional oils and or surfactants to get better control. We can also use the triclopyr formulations, typically the amine formulations, the water-based, as foliar applications. But it needs to be recognized these are broadleaf herbicides that are not going to be effective on invasive grasses, whereas glyphosate has a broad spectrum of control over a wide variety of plants, both grasses and broadleaves. Some candidates for basal bark spraying or cut stump and spray applications. Tree of Heaven is one example of a plant that we really recommend you do basal bark spraying where possible. The reason being, Tree of Heaven has a very strong root sprouting response to any kind of damage. Even when we use a herbicide in a girdle or cut the tree off and we'll herbicide the stump, unless we just literally soak that stump with herbicide, we oftentimes get a really strong root sprouting response. And we can literally have dozens to hundreds of small seedlings per acre popping up off this root system. Now, if you come in after those roots have sprouted and do a foliar application that first season, you can typically control that pretty effectively. But if you wait for a year or two, oftentimes you've got 6 foot or taller seedlings that have popped up off that root system. It becomes very difficult then to do a foliar application. So either do basal bark, or if you do cutting or girdling, be prepared to come in and do follow-up on the root sprouts that you're going to find on Tree of Heaven. Basal bark also could be effective on burning bush, privet, autumn olive, Callery pear, almost anything that presents a not too thick bark and a smaller diameter, maybe anywhere from inch to 6 or 8 inches. We can kill larger material with basal bark, but it takes a lot of material in terms of spray and time to get it all the way around that stem. So the efficiency of that operation kind of decreases. As we get larger stems, I prefer girdling or cutting, other than the case of Tree of Heaven. And so cut, stump, and spray, once again, very effective, particularly on larger examples, or if you've got a brush saw and you want to go through the area and put everything on the ground and then do some cut stump as a follow-up. Those are great applications and very effective at getting a high % kill on your invasive species. So the materials we can use for those applications are triclopyr ester in oil, so Garland 4, triclopyr 4. Another material that we can add or use in this way is imazapyr. Stalker is one of the formulations, but we have to be very careful with the amount of this material we put per acre. It does have a lot of biological activity, and so we can get non-target damage if we're over applying this material. So if you've got just scattered invasives across an area, okay to use that. If you've got a lot of invasives, I would back off and be using something like the triclopyr or the glyphosate. We mix that with spray oil. So once again, basal oil, diesel, or kerosene. Our normal amount is anywhere from 12 to 20% of our herbicide, up to 2 to 5% of imazapyr if you are so inclined and you're going to be doing a very limited application. And then the balance of that mix is oil. And if I'm just using straight triclopyr, I'm usually at least 15 to 20% triclopyr in oil. One thing to be careful with the basal bark application are high temperatures. We're putting that oil right on the stem of the tree and counting on that oil to carry the herbicide in. However, in high temperature levels during the summer, 85 degrees plus, we can actually see that oil herbicide mix volatilize, float off of our target application site, and create a haze in the understory that actually can kill native plants. or other non-target organisms and plants. So we have to be careful at those high temperatures and really avoid those when we do our applications. There are a variety of resources and assistance sources you can access to help answer your questions about invasive species management and control. As I mentioned, a really good kind of overarching gateway site is the Indiana Invasive Species Council site. Lots of good resources and references for you to tap into there. The Indiana DNR has an invasive species site that also has a phone-in number to report exotics and a variety of other resources you can access. We mentioned the smartphone app that you can utilize to report invasives and map invasives and get also identification information and help. So the EDD Maps site for Report Indiana, great resource for that. Through Purdue Extension, we also have a reporting site with a lot of references, resources, and educational materials on a variety of invasive organisms. And then another resource I'd put you to get good species by species recommendations for control is the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's control database. I use this quite often when I'm looking up different control techniques for a variety of different invasive species. They provide a really nice table that gives a lot of different options and then the rating of each of those options of how effective it's been shown by people who've actually done the control. So it's a great tool based on good on-the-ground experience. And then the other great resource to consider is that as a landowner, you may actually be eligible for cost sharing or cost assistance programs through the U.S. Department of Agriculture in your county. So invasive species are one of the practices that the USDA will do cost sharing or cost assistance on. The thing is, you have to sign up before you actually start the practice to be eligible for the cost sharing. So check the USDA site to get your local office information. Make contact with them, let them know what your management intentions are, and they can help walk you through the process if that might match up to your needs on your property. So I appreciate your attention to this program. I know many of you folks are interested in identifying and controlling invasive species on your property. Hopefully this will give you a good starting point to get the resources, information, and knowledge you need to get started working against invasive species. I will tell you that it's a very fulfilling practice. You really feel like you're making some great headway to put your property in good condition as an area of biological diversity and sustainability, and to produce the best property you can by controlling those invasives. If you have questions, feel free to contact me or the expertise I've recommended to you. Thanks for listening. We'll look forward to your questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.